Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining our regulatory Transcend live stream here. Whether it's a good morning to you if you're on the West Coast, happy lunchtime, I guess, if you're joining us from the East Coast of the States, or like 2/3 of the call, we've got a busy group. We've got Ron DeJesus from Transcend, our Chief Privacy Officer, and Dave Barmore from Runway Strategies, our regulatory expert. All time zone split. Ron and I have actually been in Brussels in Belgium this week, and where we're joining you from, where we've been for the IAPP's Europe Data Protection Congress conference this week. And maybe while we're waiting for a couple more people to join, Ron, you've been there, you've been networking with fellow industry folks at the conference. What are some of the conversations that popped up while you're on the ground there?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Ron DeJesus here, Field CPO. And it was a incredibly, just actually out of all the IAPP conferences I've been to in Europe, probably one of the most well-attended. And a lot of the conversations that I was having at the Transcend booth, above and beyond just, AI, which is on top of everyone's mind, is obviously, the anticipated downstream effects of the incoming administration, which we'll dive into later on today. But, also just, we had a couple of folks ask about my participation in the AI office working group sessions, for example, some of the code of practice draft reviews that we're doing. And had some really interesting conversations as well around just, how folks are dealing with this existing patchwork of state privacy laws, which again, I'm happy to be focusing on with Dave and you here today as well, Andrew.
Yeah, awesome. It definitely was a busy couple of days. And despite the cold, I think we had a little bit of dusting of ice. We didn't quite get snow, but it definitely kept everyone on their toes and lots of coats and things like that. But it was a great conference. Well, with that, though, I can see a few more people have joined. So we'll jump into kind of what we're here for today. So the goal of this session is to really give you a look ahead to 2025 and what you can expect both on the federal front and the state front here in the United States and what's ahead. Obviously, it has been a very busy few weeks since the start of November. We have a new president-elect in Donald Trump. We have a change of control in the US federal Congress and what that will mean. And we also obviously have our fractured kind of state landscape moving ahead with full force. And we'll touch on that too, with things that are coming, new laws that are coming online next year, and a look at some enforcement areas to keep watch for. So let me just take control of this slide deck and we'll jump on into the next section. So what's ahead? As I mentioned, we'll look ahead to DC and what we can expect on the federal front, where the privacy bill stands, what we can expect in the next couple of months before the new administration comes into the executive branch. Then we'll dive into a state look ahead, and then we'll finish on some compliance deadlines, really in those kind of first 2 to 3 months of 2025 and what to look for. So that is kind of what we're going to cover. You can see the comments panel on the side. We're also streaming this live to LinkedIn, so you can leave us comments there, and the team will kind of monitor that and we'll weave those into the conversations as we go. But as I mentioned, we've got our two experts here on the call to cover off on both what we can expect on the regulatory front, but also if you're a privacy practitioner, how that should affect how you're thinking about your privacy strategies. If you're a CPO, if you're a program manager, or even on the technical side, how you should be thinking about adapting. So that's kind of what we'll aim to cover off in the next 45 minutes. As I mentioned, if you have comments or questions, use that side panel and we'll try and weave those into the conversations today. But with that kind of preamble sorted, Dave, I might hand off to you to kind of get us started from DC and what we can expect. Obviously, everyone is really focused on what President Trump's picks are, what the transition team is thinking for different agencies. But we've also got this kind of interim period now where the Senate is moving forward with confirmations of federal judges. Is there any hope for APRA federal privacy? Help us understand maybe first to start off what we can expect from the next few months before we move into late January next year.
Sounds great. Thanks, Andrew. Thrilled to be with you all again and partnering up with my guy here, Ron, on our virtual roadshow. So excited for another installment. I'm coming to you all from DC, where we just had our first snow of the season. So this Midwestern guy is very excited. As Andrew mentioned, Very interesting time here in our nation's capital as we are going through this transition period with the recent election that was just weeks ago. It seems like it was already a lifetime ago, but a lot of changes now in motion with President-elect Trump announcing all of his different nominations, which we'll continue to see roll out in a steady pace going up into his inauguration on January 20th. So this period, as Andrew mentioned, is called the lame duck session. It's the period of time where the current Congress, so these are members that were elected 2 years ago, have a period of time where they meet after this election and before the new Congress reconvenes in late January. So as Andrew mentioned, there have been a number of bills that have been out there on data privacy, on children's online safety. As you all know, APRA, the American Privacy Rights Act, was unfortunately, I think, stalled in the House due to some Republican leadership concerns. That is unfortunately dead, and we don't expect that to be advanced during the lame duck session. COSA, again, another Children's Online Safety Act, I think is also unfortunately at an impasse in the House as well. And so those two measures we should not expect to be brought up. However, AI, a lot of conversation on AI. There is likely to be some kind of package that will be tacked on to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is an annual measure that the Congress has to pass. This AI measures, what's expected is that there is as part of President Biden's executive order on AI, there was an AI Safety Institute under the Commerce Department. It is likely that there will be a bill passed to preserve that AI Safety Institute, which would help implement many safeguards around the use of AI. Pretty bipartisan measure. I think what will be interesting to see play out is, will Republicans allow Senate Majority Leader Schumer to move this forward, or will they want to wait this out until Trump is in office and Republicans will have full control of the legislature in January? So it is expected, Trump had made promises on the campaign trail to undo President Biden's executive order on AI. He hasn't been very specific in terms of what he doesn't like. I think it's potentially just the fact he wants to have his own mark on something. And so I think this could be an effort by the current Congress to try to preserve what they see as a very compelling and reasonable measure to maintain and preserve that AI Safety Institute. But again, we'll see if politics play a role here, and if Republicans want to kick this can to the road, down the road to when they have full control next year. So that's at a high level. They're currently in session, no rest for the weary. They're going to be meeting over the coming weeks with the goal of adjourning right before the Christmas holiday. So it'll be an action-packed couple weeks as Congress tries to move on many different issues, but I think we've highlighted just the few that I think are relevant to folks on the call today.
Dave, it was you mentioned something there about the rollback of Biden's AI kind of action there. Ron, I was just curious, you touched on this before, but in some of your conversations, it really feels like there is not just an oceanic divide here, but there is a big divide starting to form in terms of AI governance. Was that on the mind of some people as you were having their conversations about how they would balance the maturing AI Act in the EU, that you're kind of part of this operationalization kind of action with what's going on in the US? How are people thinking about the kind of the dissonance between the two?
Yeah, it was really interesting to be in Brussels, the epicenter of EU lawmaking, and to have discussions around potential impacts of this administration. Obviously, globally, we've been tasked with, as CPO has been tasked with, an AI governance hat as a result of across the pond legislation, i.e. the EU AI Act. So while I think there's a general sentiment and general agreement that on the US side, we will see a watering down and perhaps extreme revisions to AI, quote unquote, soft law, coming out of this administration. Folks are still, even US based professionals are still, gung ho on developing programs that are going to be focused on their compliance requirements coming out of the EU AI Act, coming out of the state laws that might be kind of giving some, rules around AI and how we deal with this new technology. So I think overall the sentiment was everyone agreed that there will be less focus on actual legislation on the US side, but everyone globally is still kind of laser focused on how they're operationalizing AI governance, regardless of all that. Because we have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to EU, residents and EU markets and all that. So still hyper focused there.
And then, Dave, maybe before we get into talking about what a Trump federal privacy bill may look like if we were to really get our crystal balls out, maybe I can start with maybe we can touch on FTC, FCC enforcement and what we're thinking there. I know there was a bit of chatter about Brendan Carr and the FCC and what that might look like based on some of his kind of comments in the press, but any sense of what we could expect for the FTC? And I presume Linda Khan won't stay there under the new administration.
Yeah, looking ahead to what to expect on the agency front, as you said, it's widely expected that Lina Khan will step down. Usually, if we look at President Trump's first term in office, he was very delayed in nominating Roger Simmons for the FTC chair back in 2017. So I think we should expect potentially this to become known of who Trump will tap to take over the FTC sometime in Q1. It could be a later nomination announcement there. But I think what's likely is that we'll see one of the two Republican commissioners that currently sit on the FTC. So that's Melissa Holyoke and Andrew Ferguson. They're two of the top contenders of who's likely to be nominated to run the agency. In terms of what that means for the data privacy industry, enforcement action, I think it's fair to say that whatever Republican nominee that will take over the FTC will largely take a deregulatory focus. I do think what is likely to continue is the scrutiny on big tech and their practices on data privacy, children's online safety. I think so. I won't say that it's going to be a quiet 2 to 4 years in terms of how the FTC is looking to continue enforcement on tech, but I think it's safe to say there will still be a continuation of a lot of the enforcement activity, but just under a different lens with more of the pro-business, pro-innovation lens of the Republican Party. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, it was just announced this last weekend that Brendan Carr, who's a longtime current commissioner on the FCC, he was formerly the general counsel at the agency as well. He was just nominated by President Trump to lead the FCC. He's an interesting pick. He was one of the authors of the Project 2025 agenda. And in that document outlined some fairly aggressive stances the agency could take on regulating and reining in big tech, namely calling out some of the issues that have bubbled up around Section 230 and how some of these larger tech companies are using that to shield themselves from liability. There's some debate on whether the FCC has the authority to go after that issue of the Section 230 law. So I think it'll be interesting to see that play out. But fair to say, I think we should expect and keep a close eye on the FCC on, like I said, social media, children's online safety, and also data privacy as well.
And maybe on that front, the last bullet point we kind of have here, this idea of a trifecta in place, well, really also a Supreme Court that rules in favor here. Are there any, when you think about a federal privacy bill, when we think about what that might look there, maybe children's privacy will come up again, much as it did in this kind of current session. But are there any state bills that perhaps prove a model for what a new federal privacy bill, knowing that APRA is probably out the window now, so where do we kind of go now with the federal bill, or was it likely that for the foreseeable future, the states will continue to kind of lead the charge on the regulation, but also the enforcement?
I think what's certain is that the states will take an even more aggressive role in moving on their own legislative proposals as it relates to social media data privacy. We just saw this week in New York, one of the state senators has introduced a new children's online safety bill, building on what the New York State Legislature passed last year. It's called the Children's Online Safety Act. So COSA versus the Kids Online Safety Act, which is the federal proposal. But I do think looking ahead for what to expect from Congress in 2025, what folks should watch now is the leadership of who is going to take over the committees of jurisdiction in both the House and the Senate. So on the Senate side, that's the Senate Commerce Committee. Under Republican control now, Senator Cruz from Texas will now be the chair of that committee. The conversation now is what I've heard, and we'll see how this plays out in Q1 of 2025, but there has been conversation of whether with his role as leadership on Senate Commerce, could there be an appetite to use his home state of Texas and their data privacy law that was passed back in 2023, could that be used as a model for federal law? Of course, all those issues around preemption, private right of action, which the Texas bill does not have, to be clear. So we'll see that debate play out on, is notice and consent sufficient, data minimization? All those issues will not go away. Democrats will now have a more difficult time being in the minority in both the House and Senate to advocate for those positions. So, and I'll just finish it out on the House side. It is the House Energy and Commerce Committee. There are two front runners for the leadership between Bob Latta and Brett Guthrie. So we'll see who ends up taking the chair on House E&C. I think one notable absence will be Kathy McMorris Rogers, who was the opponent of APRA this year. She was the one pushing very hard to get that passed. On the House side, was not successful, but I think she was really hoping for that to be her legacy before she is now exiting with this current Congress, as she'll be retiring. So it'll be interesting to see with her now no longer on energy and commerce, how much of the driving force will be on the House side for a federal data privacy standard. So kind of the big picture, and I know we'll dive into more of the state activity, but that's all but certain going to be fast and furious from January to July of next year.
Lots of open questions for us to try and work out the answer. Ron, before we dive into the states with Dave, maybe I'll ask you this question a few times, right, on this stream, but what do you take away from that federal outlook as a practitioner, as someone who's been a CPO of these kind of global brands, thinking through like 2025, 2026? What are you kind of paying attention to? Or is it kind of just like much of status quo right now in terms of federal uncertainty right now?
Yeah, I think as an operational professional, and some of the conversations that I had during the conference was we're revolving around what do we do now as we wait and see. And I think the general sentiment from my peers was, we're still kind of full force ahead when it comes to developing our governance programs and making sure that we up-level our existing controls and programs around privacy and AI governance. We say that because, obviously, regardless of anticipated enforcement from an FTC or FCC perspective, it's still really important to build programs that support, user optics and making sure that, and I apologize if I'm not coming through on your end, my connection's. Oh, good. Okay, cool. This concept of reputational risk is still something that is really top of mind for executive boards. So again, while we tend to use as operational professionals the stick of enforcement, I think we should still go full steam ahead, making sure that we build products and services that keep consumer privacy in mind. I wanted to hit on a couple of points though, Andrew, on APRA and impending federal legislation. I read a recent article where the former FTC Commissioner, John Leibowitz, basically said that he essentially thinks that there's actually going to be a lot of activity around impending privacy legislation, given the administration's control of both houses, which was an interesting fact to me or perspective to me. And he also mentioned that there is potential for, obviously APRA to have modifications, but to have a federal legislation that might be weaker, have no private right of action, but still have preemption, which would kind of appease both sides of the House, or at least Republicans. So that was an interesting perspective to see from a former FTC commissioner to just food for thought there. And then again, just from a state law perspective, again, we're what, 20 states in, we have a bunch of activity that's going to happen Jan 2025, which I know Dave is going to get into. So we're again, just going full steam ahead with operationalizing our privacy programs based on these emerging laws. And I don't think that's going to stop regardless of whether or not, the FTC is going to come at us as companies. So just some food from the operational end.
One quick thing, Andrew, if I can just piggyback off of what Ron said, going back to that issue of preemption, I think it'll be interesting to see, let's say, for instance, this Texas proposal with Cruz in the leadership role in the Senate, if that does take hold and we see that as kind of the federal model, that debate on should this federal bill be the floor or the ceiling of how states can then potentially build on that. So there could be a scenario in which this bill is introduced and it's the law of the land across the board in all 50 states, but states could have the ability to go above that and introduce their own private right of action, which would only be applicable for their state's jurisdiction. So that debate's played out on the sticky preemption issue, but I think that'll be something to watch in addition to the private right of action. But I think a unique kind of twist with the Texas angle given Senator Cruz there. So
yeah, absolutely. And maybe that's a good segue to going from DC to now some of the highlights of what's been happening on the state front, because it has also, despite the US election still in the headlines, it's also been a busy few weeks. So Dave, maybe you can kick us off there and maybe we start with California and kind of understand what's been there. I know there was a board meeting, I think 2.5 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago now. Maybe you can kind of give us a recap of what's moving there.
Yeah, I will say we're hitting it all on this session. We're doing federal, we're doing state, we're also doing local with the DC Council. So we're full 360 analysis here. So yeah, let's dive in on the states. The Friday after the election, it was a jam-packed week for many reasons. The California Privacy Protection Agency held their board meeting on that Friday afternoon. The agenda was a jam-packed meeting, 3 to 4 hours long. The top of the list was this agenda item around updating the existing rules on data brokers. I see some of you in the comments have asked about data brokers and federal legislation. I think, folks should be watching these California developments as it relates to data brokers, as there has been a lot of activity on this front. So this new proposed rule that was finalized during this board meeting, which is now in process it'll likely go into effect beginning of the year. But what this rule does is it significantly expands the range of companies that will be required to register as a data broker. And this is, of course, all building on the Delete Act, which was a bill that was passed by the state legislature years ago. But that Delete Act provided that organizations without a direct relationship with consumers that sell personal data must register, where these new rules that are set to go into effect would state that a business does not have to have a direct relationship if it sells any data, and the definition of data sale is defined very broadly, but that is not collected directly from a data subject. So really expansive definition there. Also increasing the annual fees that a business would have to pay. That registration deadline is January 1st of every year. So I would encourage folks to really dive into these rules to understand, does this impact you? If so, again, as of January 1, these new rules will be in effect and you could have to register with the CPPA as of the end of January. One final thing is that they are working towards January 2026 of a universal deletion method. So the agency is working on how to implement that and build that out. So I think we'll continue to see developments on that universal deletion method where consumers will be able to opt out of and have their data deleted and not have to go data broker to data broker, but have that universal deletion method in place by January 2026. Next thing, really quickly, automated decision-making technology. So compared to the data broker rule, which was finalized, the ADMT rule was just kicked off. So they're now beginning their rulemaking process on the ADMT. This has been something that the agency has been talking about for nearly all of 2024. There's been a lot of debate on how they're defining automated decision-making technology. The definitions there from industry's perspective are very broad, where this would be wide sweeping, would capture many, many companies that are using these types of technologies within their business practices. Regardless of the debate and some of the pushback they've received, the agency has decided to move forward with these rules. So they're now beginning the rulemaking process, which consists of a public comment period. This will likely go into 2025. The rules as they stand now could likely change when they're implemented sometime later next year, but that's something to be on the lookout for. So all that to say, it was a jam-packed meeting, and two of those issues, like I said, data brokers, ADMT, will continue to track those and monitor well into 2025.
And from an operational perspective, Andrew, I'd say, obviously from a data broker rule, I would say the large majority of us aren't going to be impacted as B2C businesses because we have a direct relationship with consumers. But obviously, I would still, as a CPO, make sure I understand the definitions of indirect collection and whether or not that impacts me. I think the ADMT rulemaking from an operational perspective, is if you've already been complying with the GDPR, which has some, requirements around the use of ADM, I think you're in a good spot because we're already providing the opt-out, we're already providing transparency, we're already doing DPIAs. So you're likely not, the delta between what you're doing now and what this updated rule might have in terms of requirements is probably going to be a lower lift for more mature programs.
Good to know. Dave, let's maybe switch gears now to Texas. We spoke a little bit before about maybe that may be the blueprint for federal, but let's go back to Texas solely for now. What's kind of happening there and what's expected in the next kind of 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, so Austin is gearing up. Texas is unique in that it is one of a handful of states where their state legislative body meets every other year. So state legislature was not in session in 2024, but they are gearing up for 2025. So legislators are now descending upon the Austin state capitol and they're filing bills. I think it was last week, there were hundreds of bills that were filed that will be considered next year. One bill to watch is this draft AI bill that was modeled after the EU AI Act and the Colorado AI Act that was passed earlier this year. Texas is looking to take its own approach on regulating and casting a wide net on regulatory framework for AI. This bill has been introduced by a representative, Capriglione, who was the bill author of the data privacy law. So needless to say, he is out there, and whether it's data privacy or AI, Chairman Capriglione is looking to really be the leader on these issues. So he has introduced the Texas Responsible AI Governance Act, TREGA. And what this would do is essentially establish different obligations for developers, deployers, and distributors of high-risk AI systems. And there's a definition for how they're defining high-risk AI systems. It creates a regulatory sandbox program that would allow different AI developers to test their systems under a way that they would be exempt from some of these rules. But I think last thing I'll note on this is there also is a small business carve out similar to the carve out that was also in the data privacy bill. So continue to watch that. They just unveiled the first draft of this bill. Capriglione is actually hosting a stakeholder session in 2 hours this afternoon. So there will, I'm sure, be many industry representatives that are a part of this stakeholder session, but that will be something to watch. And I do want to point out that Chairman Capriglione is a part of this multi-state AI working group that actually the Future Privacy Forum has convened. And he's one of, I believe, a dozen or so state legislators that are just coordinating on this issue. So I think we're likely to see similar TREGA bills pop up from other members of this multi-state working group that are state legislators in other states. Connecticut, I think, is a state to watch as they've pushed for a number of AI proposals in previous years. So that's one update on Texas. A couple other notes. In terms of enforcement, the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, has been very active on the privacy enforcement front for much of 2024, spring and summer. Some of the big cases that have been brought on some of the major players like TikTok and Meta, big time settlements, record-breaking settlement agreements reached over violations of children's online safety laws, biometric data laws. So I think it's fair to say that we'll continue to see an aggressive stance that the Attorney General is taking in enforcing their children's online safety law and their data privacy law that was passed in 2023. One final note, I will say Ken Paxton has been on the list of candidates for President Trump's attorney general. As I'm sure everyone has seen this week, Pam Bondi is now the new nominee for AG. If she's confirmed, that would obviously mean that Ken Paxton will remain in his role as Texas AG. But I just raise that as, if for whatever reason Pam is not confirmed, Ken still could potentially accept that nomination, which would then mean a new attorney general for Texas would take over, which would be interesting to see how that impacts kind of enforcement activity within the state of Texas. So a lot of moving pieces there, but did just want to kind of point that out, given there's been some chatter on the AG of Texas being considered for the federal role.
Yeah, confirmation watch continues at full speed for the next few weeks.
Never a dull moment.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned too the coordination through the Future of Privacy Forum on the EU on the AI front across the states. I feel like, Ron, I can hear some of the CPOs breathing a sigh of relief that we're not having a whole multiplication of fragmentation, at least on that front, and there's some coordination. Well, Dave, maybe to kind of round out, I think, our state kind of look around, I think you wanted to touch on DC and Colorado.
Yes, just a couple other recent updates on privacy-related developments at the state and local level. So we'll start with Colorado. They obviously have an existing privacy law, the Colorado Privacy Act, that was put into place years ago now. The Attorney General, which is the main enforcer of that law, has recently introduced some amendments to their existing state law. And these amendments pertain to biometric data and children's privacy, just really building on some of the requirements as it relates to DPIAs and consent requirements when companies are utilizing children's data and biometric data. So I'd encourage folks to take a look at those rules. There was just a public hearing. I think it's expected that the amendments would go into effect July of next year. So those are still ongoing, but something to watch for Colorado. One final note on Colorado, like I said, the state legislature did pass a first in the nation comprehensive AI bill this last year. With the governor signing that bill, he basically declared that the state would revisit the issue, as there were a lot of concerns, I think, raised from the AG, from the governor, from some of the legislators. So it's very likely that the process has already started on revisiting that state AI law. So I think something to watch in terms of their state legislature for 2025 as well. Final thing on DC, the city council has been pushing for a health data privacy law, CHIPA, which for those of you that are familiar with the Washington State My Health, My Data Act, Nevada passed a similar law, very similar proposal that the DC City Council is considering. They had a hearing in mid-October, which now would allow the bill to transition into the 2025 working period for the council. Again, very similar to the Washington My Health, My Data Act. Be sure to watch that as that progresses through the DC City Council well into 2025.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess, Ron, to you just really quickly, it continues to show that even as federal we wait and see, these specific bills targeting subclasses of data continue to kind of move along, which I guess would leave CPOs in the same boat of wanting to understand, really get a hold of like those sensitive classes of data and what's moving where across the business and for what use cases.
Yeah, all I can say for CPOs is job security. I mean, like, we are tasked day to day with, understanding we just got through My Health, My Data, and now we have CHIPA to worry about, right? So again, really, the complexity never ends. And it's not like, it is part of our job to look at these day to day, but it does make our jobs incredibly complex. I will say, as Dave's going through the state laws, and I know you're going to get into kind of the next year's impending laws, Dave, but I will say, as I'm reading them, nothing particularly groundbreaking that I'm seeing, because we've already, again, developed baseline controls around, to your point, Andrew, identifying sensitive personal information, transparency requirements, consent requirements. With the Colorado AI Act, for example, that was modeled after the EU AI Act. And I spoke to someone that was on the EU side of things during the discussions and the trilogues for the EU AI Act. Some of the Colorado Act's provisions are actually direct lifts from the EU AI Act. So I mentioned that because, again, as we see what's happening in the States, if we have a really solid foundation that is focused on, again, some of the stuff that we've already been dealing with since 2018, GDPR, that has forced requirements extraterritorially, we're in a good place. So while the distinct nuances state by state are annoying and we need to handle in real time, having a really solid foundation is something that I think most of my peers already have in place.
Yeah. I also, as a final note on that section, Dave, I love that the city council is kind of taking Congress's lead in finding fun acronyms. Like, happily to talk about chipper every day. That puts me in a great mood just hearing about that one. So maybe here's to more distinct acronyms. 25.
So you mentioned Congress. One final note on DC, which I think is interesting. Congress has to date had a role in having to approve of whatever the DC City Council passes. There's the council passes a law, it then goes to Congress for a congressional approval. I think it'll be interesting to see with the Republican trifecta now at the federal level, if that changes the authority and the latitude that the DC City Council has to move on its own laws. So that I think will be interesting. This as a check on, will Republican held Congress exert even more pressure and influence over what the DC City Council does? So I think that is something that they'll have to weigh now going into the new congressional period next year. So
yeah, a lovely DC quirk. Well, we have about 2 to 3 minutes before we kind of said we'd wrap up today. So Dave, maybe you can take us out by looking at a very busy January and the start of next year. Walk us through kind of the key deadlines to watch for, I'm sure on most people's radars, but just to reinforce these kind of key dates and what's moving when.
Yeah, so as you can see on this slide, these are just a handful of the bills of the 20 bills that have now been passed of states that have their own comprehensive data privacy laws. These are the bills that have been passed within the last year or two that are set to go into effect as of January 1, January 15th, looking at New Jersey there. But so we've got Iowa, Delaware, New Hampshire, Nebraska, and New Jersey. All those laws, like I said, will be in effect as of the first of the year. Looking at some of those states and some of the nuances that and differences that are unique to the state laws, Iowa is a particularly interesting one. The bill itself only applies to entities in the state that are non-commercial and non-employment in context. So an interesting scope of applicability there. There is no right to correction of data, which is usually a fairly standard consumer right in other state bills. No DPIAs and no use of authorized agents. So very interesting take in Iowa. So I encourage you to take a look in that. Some of the other states I'll just highlight at a very high level, lower applicability thresholds as to which entities would have to be subject to the laws. So I'd encourage folks to look at how they're defining the scope of the laws, as many of the states have a lower threshold. They don't include a revenue threshold or so on and so forth. And then the last thing I'll note is just Colorado and Connecticut. Both of those existing state laws had cure periods. So this would be a window of time that the AG in the state has allowed for businesses that are in violation of the law to come into compliance. So it's usually for these two states, it's a 60-day window. That 60-day cure period, they expire for Colorado and Connecticut, December 31st and January 1st. So just to be mindful of that unique provision in those two states. Ron, any of those states, I know you said nothing really groundbreaking, but any takeaways with those?
Yeah, my 30 seconds on that is one, look at sensitive data inventory. New Jersey, because I think what's going on in the background, guys?
It's a very noisy Antwerp street scene.
Then super quickly on Iowa, it's just funny that they departed from status quo, like no correction, no DPIAs, no use of authorized agents, because operationally speaking, great. Like I'm not gonna go and not give an Iowan resident if they request to correct, I'll probably let them correct, So it's just funny to see these nuances state by state, but operationally, from an operational impact perspective, not very impactful to us because we already have those controls in place. So anyway.
Yeah, wonderful.
Just to be clear, the noise was not coming from me. That was all Ron Is that Andrew?
So where we are in Antwerp is right outside the main train station and the city square. So there's a lot of liveliness happening outside tonight. I think people know it's a 6:45 here. So I think the party's just getting started. But with that, thank you both. This has been great. We've covered a lot of ground. For everyone that's kind of watching on the live stream, we will edit up this. We will post it on the Transcend website. You can find the recording early next week, if not a little bit before then, at transcend.io/resources. And if you're watching this on LinkedIn, I believe it'll kind of pop up there probably a little bit later today. So keep an eye out for a recording if you want to watch back on this. We've also got the Transcend blog, which is transcend.io/blog, which has our comprehensive explainers as each of the new state laws get closer, and we'll look at the similarities and differences of those and with content there. There's a weekly newsletter, Snippets, which comes out every Thursday morning, and you can sign up to that on the Transcend website. Just scroll down to the bottom, to the footer, and we will be back, the three of us, in the new year, I'm sure. There will, as Dave alluded to, there will continue to be developments with a new administration and how things move there and what enforcement looks like. So we'll be sure to come back onto this and keep in touch as those things move along. And so lots to follow on there. Thank you, everyone, for joining, whatever time it is, wherever you are. And we'll keep you posted as things continue to develop. But Ron and Dave, thanks so much for joining.
Bye, everyone.
Awesome.
Have a good
Thanks,
weekend.
everyone,
Happy
for joining.
holidays.
Bye-bye.